Hey guys, and welcome to Chapter 10, Part 1. Please don't mind the noise in the background. I'm currently filming this at school, and so that's probably the air conditioning that you hear. This is, I know, kind of late getting up. It'll probably get up around 4 o'clock at this point. You always have your book. These are done as a courtesy, so while it is, I do apologize for this not going up as quickly as I would like. You always can use the book to go ahead and get this done. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so this first part is largely about agriculture and how it is represented throughout the globe. Alright, the central case was about the use of genetically modified organisms, in this case corn, in Mexico, which is where modern corn originated. It comes from Mexico. How is the traditional corn different from what's called transgenic corn? Traditional corn developed through selective breeding or artificial evolution. As you can see there on the left, teosinte is a kind of grass that was through artificial selection, where you take the plants with the fattest ears and you continue to breed them together until you get the modern maize or corn hybrid that we have today. Transgenic corn contains genes from an entirely different species, usually bacteria, which could not get into the corn without in-lab engineering. In genetically modified organisms, which we will discuss more in depth in class because that is kind of a loaded and charged concept, we will discuss the pros and cons. And when you make these genetic modifications, they can do everything from increasing the yield of the individual corn plants, to allowing them to grow with less water, to allowing them to create their own pesticides so that they fight off pests that try to eat them on their own, as opposed to spraying an entire field and, you know, incidentally killing other stuff, growing in salty soil, etc., etc., etc. So there are some pros, and we'll discuss the pros and cons a little bit later on in this video. Here at the top are all of the different varieties of corn that are grown in Mexico, and you can see in the lower right hand corner how some folks feel about the transgenic corn. One of the beefs, and this is actually very valid, is that it narrows the amount of genetics that are available in corn plants in general. So that means that if you're no longer growing the heirloom varieties, which is what these are called, heirloom meaning something that's old but still well loved, if you no longer grow those heirlooms and allow them to go extinct, you're not hedging your bets. If the other corn, something comes through and wipes it all out, then you have no corn. You're done. When you have genetic variety, remember that high level of biodiversity allows for a pre-adaptation to occur in the face of some unforeseen future tragedy that will allow the species to continue. All right. What is food security? It's the guarantee of an adequate and reliable food supply available to all people at all times. What does food security depend upon? Maintaining healthy soil, water, and biodiversity. And here in this graphic, you can kind of see the things that go into food security. Now, do you realize this is not something that occurs just in third world countries? We have a lot of food insecure people in this country, and quite frankly here in this school. Folks who rely upon our free and reduced lunch program, or as we have now, breakfast and lunch free and available to everyone, in order to feed themselves. And that means that over the summer, they don't know what days they're going to be fed and which days that they're not. So it's that reliable and consistent source of quality food. Reliable, consistent, quality, not just, you know, Fritos from the corner store as an example. All right, let's see. How have we increased our ability to produce food? There's 5 reasons listed in your book. Devoting more fossil fuel energy to agriculture. Instead of having animals and people do the work, you have machines. Planting and harvesting more frequently, which we can do because of genetically modified crops. Increasing the use of irrigation, fertilizer, and pesticides. Increasing the amount of land that we've cultivated for farming. So just basically converting forests and prairies into farmland. And then developing more productive crops and livestock varieties, using a combination of both crossbreeding and straight up genetic engineering, which means, again, that you're taking genes from an entirely unrelated species and putting them into your target species. All right, what's the difference between undernourished and malnourished? You can see up here. Undernutrition just means you're missing calories in general, and it's largely an economic thing, as you can see here. You can read the slide. And again, do realize that there are plenty of hungry people here in the United States. We also have our fair share of overnutrition, which you can see there, which is basically eating too many calories, and there are lots of health problems associated with that. Malnutrition means you're getting all the calories, often you're getting all the calories that you need, but you're missing a key vitamin or mineral for growth and development. All of these things, as we're going to see as we continue, largely crop up as problems in children. There are lots of diseases that are not featured in your textbook that are a part of our supplemental material. Let's see. So, two types of diseases that you need to know about are kwashiorkor and marasmus. Kwashiorkor is a high starch diet without enough protein or essential amino acids. You have bloating of the abdomen, deterioration or discoloration of hair, reduced mental abilities, and this can be a permanent learning disability if the brain doesn't get what it needs as it's going into development. And then immune suppression, developmental delays. That means you're not walking and talking when you should. Anemia and reduced growth. And then marasmus is not only do you have a protein deficiency, you have an overall lack of calories in general. And it is characterized by wasting and shriveling. This is the characteristic look of people who are starving to death. Most at risk are children, because even if they get appropriate food later on in their life, the developmental issues are kind of permanent. All right, so what are the characteristics of the Green Revolution? It goes beyond cultivating more land for crops. You increase the yield per unit area, and you do this through concentrated water use, lots of water use, genetically modified crops that are more robust. They live through a lot more and they produce more. Use of fossil fuel driven equipment, artificial fertilizer use, and then chemical pesticide use. And again, this has nothing to do with organic agriculture, which we're going to talk about in another segment. Let's see, I'm going to talk about some pros and cons. I'm going to stick to your questions and then I'll address the slides. How did the Green Revolution benefit the environment? It intensified the use of already cultivated land, so that saves other land like forests and other habitats from becoming farmland. It thus then preserves the biodiversity and the natural ecosystems and the ecosystem services that natural land provides. But how does it harm the environment? Intensive application of water, fossil fuels, inorganic fertilizer, and synthetic fertilizers worsens air and water pollution, erosion, salinization, eutrophication, and desertification. Monocultures especially, while they're easy to harvest, reduce biodiversity because they are one plant and because one plant supports little additional biodiversity. When you go into a forest, the rainforest has upwards of 200 species of plant life in there, and it supports, again, a very robust biodiversity. When you only have one plant across 600 or 800 acres, there's not a lot else that can live there. Monocultures can also easily be wiped out by one disease or pest, so the sudden loss can lead to soil erosion, water pollution from the runoff, and all of the things that happen when you don't have plants in the ground. So again, look at this slide. You may want to pause here and go ahead and read this. I'm not going to insult you by reading it to you. All right. Where did this one come into? Okay. What is an economic benefit to growing crops in a monoculture? It's very easy to cultivate and harvest them. What is a potential economic risk to growing crops in a monoculture? One pest or disease, again, can wipe them out completely, leaving a farmer with nothing to sell. Remember, what I just said are economic problems, not environmental problems. You need to be able to tell the difference. How do monocultures affect the human diet? It narrows, the narrowing of choice means that the loss of one choice can remove an entire component of the human diet from the globe. 90% of the food we consume now comes from 15 crop species and 8 livestock species. That should really make you nervous, because you lose one, there goes an entire section of your diet, really. All right. Why are the terms pest and weed subjective? It's location. A pest or a weed in one area is a nuisance, while it can be beneficial or not a problem in another. It's, again, defined by location. And we're going to talk about how overuse of pesticide leads to natural selection here momentarily. All right. differentiate between all of the different types of pesticides. Oh, here are some pests. You can see grasshopper there in the upper left-hand corner. Upper right-hand corner, those are aphids. That's what ladybugs like to eat. Lower left-hand corner, that's something called must. It grows specifically on corn, and believe it or not, it's edible, and there are some places that think it's highly desirable. But if it's growing in a place you don't want it, then it's a problem. Lower right-hand corner, you can see the weeds that are in between the rows. All right, so let me go ahead and differentiate between the different types of pesticides. Insecticides are meant to kill insects. Herbicides are meant to kill plants. Fungicides are meant to kill fungus, and rodenticides are meant to kill rodents. Okay, this is not that difficult. And we kind of ramped up what type of stuff we were using. We'll talk about this in class, but just realize we went from first-generation pesticides, which are basically what plants are to use. They're very mild, but they break down after a short amount of time, so they don't stay toxic forever. We went ahead and ramped up to more potent and wide-range killing pesticides that once they're in the environment, they kind of stay toxic forever. And that's what persistence is. It's something we're going to be talking about as we go through our human population unit. When we make stuff, sometimes it stays toxic forever. All right, so explain how pests develop a resistance to pesticide. Remember how evolution works. You have to be pre-adapted for a change. There are always going to be some insects through mutation who end up being pre-adapted to pesticides. So you use a pesticide, almost all of the insects die except for a few that are pre-adapted to the pesticides. Well, they're the ones that are left and reproduce. So after a generation or two, you have an entire family of pesticides that can resist, an entire generation of pests that can resist whatever pesticide it is that you are applying. Please realize that there's some benefits, because there are plenty of people who die from insect-carried diseases. Absolutely helps farmers, because you get, less stuff eaten by insects or goes to fungus, so more stuff you can sell at market. If they're used properly, usually not a problem. Of course, the problem is we have a tendency to treat things instead of like a scalpel, treating them like a sledgehammer. Yeah. All right. You may want to go ahead and pause these slides and read them, although they won't necessarily be on this quiz that you're taking. They will absolutely show up on national exams. So here are some disadvantages to synthetic pesticides. Here's one right here. If it's what's called broad spectrum, which means it kills everything, it can kill predators and parasites that would naturally control the pest population. It's like bycatch when we talked about farming. Fishing. All right. We're going to talk a little bit more about Roundup and the company Monsanto when we watch a little bit of Food Inc. a little bit later on in this unit. So again, you may want to pause these slides and kind of take a look at them. We will come back to them. So if you're ignoring them now, go back to this before the test. All right, biocontrols. It's the enemy of one's enemy is one's friend. So you use natural predators of pests to kill the pests. So you kind of are like, what kills you? Okay, let me bring that in, and you guys go ahead and go. Explain how BT has been used as a biocontrol. It's a naturally occurring soil bacterium that produces a protein that kills many caterpillars and the larvae of some flies and beetles. Those spores are sprayed onto crops. Genes from those bacteriums can also be isolated and spliced into plants so they can protect themselves. So that's part of where genetic modification comes in. Right, what's a possible consequence of using biocontrols? Introducing a new species into a new environment is always risky. It's an exotic, possibly to be invasive species. They can go after non-target species even if it's effective against target species. So let's go ahead and talk about what you're looking at right here, which is the cactus moth. Its larvae eats a prickly pear, which is an invasive type of cactus. The problem is it eats any cactus, and it decimates, it can, if left unchecked, decimate everything in its path. Hawaii also has a terrible track record of introduced species going after non-target and native species. It's hundreds of things that are introduced and are like, oh, you weren't supposed to do that. I mean, think about the cane toad that was introduced into Australia. It was meant to go after the cane grub, which first of all it wasn't interested in because nobody actually bothered to do any research, and then secondly it is basically, decimated entire portions of their ecosystem. So whenever you introduce a biocontrol that doesn't naturally occur in that place, you always run the risk of it becoming a problem. That doesn't always happen, but it's something that one must consider. Nature does not behave because we wag our fingers at it and say, no, no, no. All right. Again, here are some other examples of biological control. As with all things in here, take one of these examples and tuck it into the back of your brain if you need to pull it out for an FRQ. I like to remember ladybugs eat aphids. You can actually buy ladybugs by the pound, scatter them through your garden, and they'll go after these little green guys that like to suck the juice out of the plants. All right, integrated pest management is an alternative to just spraying stuff with pesticide and hoping for the best. IPM is where you use multiple different techniques to achieve long-term suppression of pests, including biocontrols, use of chemicals when needed, close monitoring of populations, habitat alteration, crop rotation, transgenic crops, alternative tillage methods, and mechanical pest removal. That means by hand. You know, also stuff like you can spray plants with boiling water if they can stand it, and that will kill pests. You can spray plants with very low-level soapy water, and that can help as well, just as an example of some things you can use instead of immediately reaching for your Roundup. All right, so how do you think IPM will differ? Okay, which step do you think would come last in IPM? Use of chemicals when needed. Go to that pesticide if you absolutely have to. Accept that there's going to be some loss in your crops, and get the general public to realize that every single piece of fruit they buy doesn't have to look perfect. One tiny little bite out of it by one tiny little worm does not mean that the entire thing is bad. You cut that part out and you move on with your day. Let's see, how do you think IPM will differ from crop to crop and region to region? It's going to need to be tailored for every individual field. So some people do find that onerous, and that you can't just have one way of doing things everywhere. You've actually got to look at what you're doing, look at your region, look at what types of pests are there, what seasons do they come, are there any natural plants that repel them that you can plant in there as a polyculture? You have to give it some thought. Ultimately though, remember, this kind of stuff saves you money, because if you kind of build up an ecosystem that naturally repels pests, then you can just let it go and not have to do anything. All right, and again, that whole unattractive food, that is a huge problem. Customers generally do not buy food that is ugly. All right, and here you can see is a training, and sometimes you just, this is always a great answer on a free response question. How can you encourage farmers to use integrated pest management? Offer free workshops, show them how to do it, give them some of the equipment for free, send out experts to go and do an evaluation on their field. Providing education is a great way to get people on board with these types of methods that are not only better for the environment, but ultimately economically better for the folks that are involved. All right. What purpose do some insects provide to crops? They're pollinating agents. Anything that has a flower, they're trying to attract something to come in there, and that's where insects come in. How else can this process take place? The ferns, conifers, and grasses pollinate by wind. So they release a lot, and you got, anybody who has allergies knows this. When your nose goes crazy, it's because there's lots of pollen in the air. So more primitive plants rely on this. And by grasses, that includes everything from corn to wheat and barley and rice. And that's actually problematic when we talk about genetically modified organisms, but that's coming in a minute. Let's see. Other pollinating animals include birds and bats. This is not in your book, but some monkeys also will pollinate. I'll have to see if I can pull that footage for you and show you it happening. However, bees are the big mamma jamma when it comes to that stuff. Let's see why, and you can see that people actually make a living out of taking beehives, and these are all beehives here on the left hand side, and taking them from place to place for pollination to occur. However, we have noticed that entire colonies in the course of a day or two just simply disappear or all die. That is called colony collapse disorder. And why do we think that this happens? Accidentally introduced parasitic mites, overuse of pesticides. And then there are other reasons that we just don't know why this is happening. But it's a huge problem. If we don't have pollinators, we don't have food. You don't have apples, you don't have oranges, you don't have all of the things that you like to eat. Now, traveling beehives, good or bad idea. I'll talk about this in class, but think about it. If you're constantly stressing out these organisms by moving them from place to place to place, they really don't tolerate that very well. That might also be contributing to some of these colonies disappearing. All right. How are genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, differ from those that result from artificial selection? Artificial selection is selective evolution, pushing organisms in the direction of one set of desired traits that are already present in the organism. GMOs take genes from completely different organisms, usually bacteria, and surgically splices them into the target organism. It's usually done with the help of a bacterium plasmid, which we're going to talk about in a second, but sometimes they're shot directly into the plant. They're not always heritable, which means you can't always pass them down from generation to generation, and it's only happening with plants. We can't do this with animals. And problems also, who owns the genetic material? We're going to talk about this in just a second. Here's how this occurs. How do scientists create recombinant DNA? Please take a look at figure 10.12 on page 273 of your textbook. I'm not kidding, go look at it, because I'm not going to read to you something that's in your book. You can also see a picture here of how this works. You have your target gene, you put it into the bacteria, and the bacteria passes it on to the plant cells, and then there you go. What is a plasmid? It's a small circular DNA molecule from a bacterial culture that's readily shared from bacterium to bacterium. What is another name for an organism that contains DNA from another species? It's called a transgenic organism. Right, this is all stuff that we've talked about. Right, here too, feel free to pause any of these slides if you want to take a look at them a little bit more in depth. Will you be expected to describe this in detail? Probably not, but you need to have a grip as to how this works. Okay, we've already talked about this. We will probably have a debate on GMOs in class. Let's see, what else? You really need to read the page on pages 274 to 275, figure 10-13. That's not in the video. Crack open your book and take a look. There are 3 or 4 varieties of stuff, everything from tomatoes, I think, to strawberries, and they talk about how those organisms are GMOs. So please make sure that you take a look at that. All right. Pros and cons, again, we're going to go over this in class. What are 4 U.S. crops that are genetically modified? Canola, soybeans, cotton, and corn. And again, when it comes to question 20 on your list of questions, I may fully quiz you on that, all right? You need to go look at that one page in your book. On the left, here's an example of some GMOs. On the left is a non-GMO plant exposed to caterpillars, and on the right is a GMO plant that has been genetically modified to have naturally occurring herbicides in it, exposed to the same number of caterpillars. You can see it makes a big difference. Okay, and then we've already talked about this. Canola is here in the upper right-hand corner. That's used to make oil. Soybeans are here in the lower right-hand corner. Cotton you can see down here. And then corn, you're familiar with what that looks like. All right, what are some benefits to GMOs? Less pesticide and water use depending on modifications made. Increase in yield per unit area. Reduction in carbon emissions when combined with no-till agriculture because crop residues stay on or in the soil. What are some drawbacks? It can result in more pesticide use if plants are engineered to withstand herbicide use. For example, Monsanto soybeans. You can see here, that's the way it works. Those are called Roundup Ready soybeans. So you can spray the whole field and not have to worry about killing your plants. Of course, that means eventually weeds build up resistance and you have to keep spraying them with more and more and more. Possible human health effects, but we haven't seen those yet. You know, people worry about these, what they call frankenfoods, being eaten. We haven't seen any problems. Formation of super pests that can resist Bt resistance engineered into plants. That hasn't happened yet. Ruination of genetic integrity of native plants when inevitable crossbreeding takes place. Crossbreeding has happened, but we haven't seen any effect on native plants yet. So a lot of the drawbacks are what are called the precautionary principle, and that we're not quite sure. Let's see. Explain how the company Monsanto is involved in the GMO market. They created what's called Roundup-resistant crops like soybeans. You spray Roundup, which is a herbicide, right on the plants, and nothing happens to them, but it kills the weeds around them. This makes spraying for weeds very easy. How does the company interact with independent farmers? Very aggressively. They protect their patented genes, and that's something that's really interesting, is the genetics are patented. If some patented soybean pollen falls on a farmer's non-Monsanto crops and fertilizes them, because remember soybeans can be pollinated by wind, the farmer is then prosecuted for stealing. You also cannot save and plant seed or use seed without a paid contract from Monsanto. So you have to buy seed every single year. You can't just save the best seeds from last year's crop and plant them again. It is against the law, and you'll be sued until you're bankrupted. Lawsuits can take years and bankrupt the independent farmers. And we'll discuss the implications of that a little bit later on. And then which region blocked the import of genetically modified foods from 1998 to 2003? That's the European Union, so most of Europe did not accept those foods. And that brings us to the end. Please, please, please look at the pictures that I told you to in your book.